Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over some more sample problems from the Life Science Biology Regents exam. This is the test that's going to be replacing the Living Environment Regents this June 2025. So I've uploaded this video so you guys can get a better feel for how the questions on this new exam are, the level of difficulty, what they want you to know, and what they look like. If you want a more in-depth review on how this exam is formatted, I've already uploaded a video going over that. Please check it out in the description. I highly recommend it. That being said, we're going to go ahead and start off with the Old Forest sample cluster of questions. It starts up here in this paragraph, which tells us that in 2009, fossilized root networks of the oldest known forest in the world were found in Cairo, New York. This forest dates to the Devonian period 383 million years ago. Scientists claim that this ancient forest is very important for understanding Earth's climate and biological history, and that it may provide valuable insight to changes that are taking place on Earth today. One such group of plants, Archaeopteryx, is represented by the figures below. So we know that the earliest trees that we can find on this planet Earth came from the Devonian period 383 million years ago. And how do we know this? Well, we found fossilized root networks in New York State. We can see here how these cracks in the dirt, or these kind of ridges in the dirt, or I guess this is rock, not dirt, because they had to dig this out. This shows old roots, right? Root networks from these trees that were called Archaeopteryx. And finally, they use this information within root networks to kind of estimate or guess as to what these ancient trees look like. So this is what those ancient trees kind of look like. Right, so then we continue down here where they give us a model that shows the interactions between spheres of the Earth during the Devonian period. So you may be asking, what do you mean spheres of the Earth? This doesn't show any spheres, and that's because they're talking about the biosphere, right? We know that the entire environment or the entire ecosystem in a given place is represented by the biosphere. So all of the energy, all of the life, everything that's coming in and out of the environment is a part of a biosphere. And we divide this biosphere into three parts, right? The first part is the geosphere, which is all of the interactions, all of the energy, all of the animals that are coming from the ground, right? Think about it. The G in geosphere stands for ground, right? And then we also split up the biosphere into the atmosphere. This might be the most recognizable sphere, because we talk about the atmosphere pretty frequently, but the atmosphere is anything to do with the air. So it's any animal that's living in the air, or anything that is released into the air, the energy that comes from that air, all right? And then finally, we have the hydrosphere, which I guess I should have put in blue. And the hydrosphere, I ran out of space, but the hydrosphere essentially describes anything or any animals or any energy or any interaction that's occurring wherever there is water, right? So these are the three different spheres. We can see here how the main interaction between the atmosphere and the biosphere and the geosphere is the release or the absorption of these greenhouse gases. Now, what could these greenhouse gases be? Well, obviously it's going to be carbon dioxide. Why? Because humans weren't around at this time to burn fossil fuels, right? As a matter of fact, fossil fuels probably weren't made yet, because the dinosaurs didn't come around in the Devonian period. They came later. So the only greenhouse gas we know of right now is carbon dioxide, right? So number one asks us, which statement correctly describes the role of one process involved in the cycling of carbon between two of the Earth's systems illustrated in the model. So which one of these choices is going to accurately say how carbon dioxide is moved from the geosphere to the atmosphere, or from the atmosphere to the hydrosphere, or from the geosphere to the hydrosphere? So how is carbon being moved? So if you look at choice one, it says that during combustion, Archaeopteryx burns, which releases carbon from the geosphere to the biosphere as carbon dioxide is absorbed. Well, let's look at what happens here. So as this tree burns, it's set on fire somehow. That's combustion, right? Combustion is when anything is on fire. And that combustion actually releases greenhouse gases, or it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This choice says that carbon dioxide is absorbed. That's false, right? The arrow shows the direction of whatever is released. So if this arrow is going to the atmosphere, that means it's released to the atmosphere. It's not absorbed by the atmosphere. Sorry, it's not absorbed by the tree, right? It's released into the atmosphere. It's not absorbed back into the ground. It's actually released, again, into the air. Whenever you burn something, it releases CO2, right? So that's why this is false, right? It's saying that carbon dioxide is absorbed. Number two says, during the respiration, the Archaeopteryx cycles carbon from the atmosphere to the biosphere as carbon dioxide is absorbed. Now, this is wrong because what is respiration? Well, respiration is just abbreviated or shortened version of cellular respiration. And what that does is it takes oxygen plus sugar, and it produces H2O or water plus CO2 plus ATP or energy. And here we are, this CO2. As the Archaeopteryx respirates, right, as it breathes, as it burns the sugar that it produced from photosynthesis with the oxygen in the in the atmosphere, it produces CO2. So carbon dioxide is actually released during respiration. It's not absorbed, right? Then choice 3 says during decomposition, Archaeopteryx decays, cycling carbon from the biosphere to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide is released. So let's look at what happens here. So here, we know that this Archaeopteryx is going to decompose because it's broken in half, right? It's dead. When you die, your body begins to decompose. When anything is dead, any living matter begins to decompose, okay? So this is a part of the biomass, right? Biomass is literally just anything that's alive, okay? We know that when this biomass dies, when you have dead biomass, it goes and it flows into the decomposers. These decomposers, well, what do? Well, they decompose, right? They undergo decomposition. Okay, and that releases two things. Number one, that leads to sedimentation, which is just the buildup of sediment or the buildup of rock. Okay, that has nothing to do with CO2. But we can't give up there because there's a second arrow that comes from decomposition. And that second arrow goes all the way into the atmosphere, and look what's being released: carbon dioxide, or these greenhouse gases, okay? And further, we know that it's carbon dioxide because it's a 3-molecule or a 3-atom molecule, right? These 3 dots represents that oxygen and those 2 carbons around it. Okay, so we know that decomposition is the only thing that releases CO2 into the atmosphere. And this choice is the only one that says that carbon dioxide is released, which is why choice 3 has to be the correct answer here. Choice 4 is wrong because it's saying that during photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is released. That's false. During photosynthesis, I'm going to draw it in green over here. We know that H2O plus CO2 is turned into, plus sunlight, very important, plus sunlight is turned into O2 plus sugars. So what has to happen here? Well, what has to happen is that carbon dioxide has to be absorbed, not released during photosynthesis, okay? So we move on. It says that the data below summarizes some of the changes that occurred in biotic and abiotic factors present on Earth before the Devonian period to the present day. These shaded areas on the graph identify the Devonian period. So here we have one graph. It shows us the change in carbon dioxide and oxygen levels on Earth. We know that wherever the shaded region is, that's the start and that's the end of the Devonian. So we see here how there was a large spike in the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, and there was a large increase in the concentration of the oxygen levels in the atmosphere during the Devonian. Then we see here how changes in plant and animal diversity. During the Devonian, we see that the number of species of plants increased, right? We see here how they had this spike, and even though it decreased a little bit, ultimately you still had more species of plants than when you began, okay? Here we see the number or the animal diversity in the environment, right? We have the number of orders increasing over time throughout the Devonian. Specifically, the number of insect genera for sure increased from somewhere around 0 to around 10 at the end of the Devonian, right? And the same thing with amphibians. The amphibian genera and orders also gradually increased through the Devonian period, right? And if you're confused as to, what a genera or what an order is, this is talking about the overview or the taxonomy of an environment, right? Which is just talking about how we organize a certain life form. So we know that it goes from a domain. So animal, this is just how we order animals, right? Or order anything on the planet, right? We go from domain, which is either you being a eukaryote, you being a prokaryote, or you being an archaea. Then it becomes more specific. Then it goes to kingdom, right? Are you a plant? Are you a fungus? Are you a bird? Or are you an animal, right? Then it goes into your phylum, right? Are you a mammal? Are you not an insect? Yeah, sure. Are you an arthropod? Are you an insect, right? Then you go into class, then order, then family, then genus, and finally, the most specific order or organization is species, right? So this is just how life is organized, right? From most specific, which is species, to least specific, which is domain. We see here how if we're increasing the number of order, if there are more orders, that means that there's more families, there's more genuses, and thus there's more species. Right, so number 2 asks, which evidence-based claim supports the presence of an environmental condition during the early Devonian period that contributed to the spread and increase of plants on the land, right? So we can see here how we actually have an increase in the number of plant species during the Devonian, but now we need to understand why. Well, if you need to grow a plant, what does it need? Well, it needs energy, right? And where do plants get their energy from? Well, they get their energy from the sunlight, through photosynthesis, which again takes sunlight plus CO2 plus H2O, or water, and it turns that into sugars plus oxygen, which they're then going to use in cellular respiration to make ATP, which is the energy that they use, right? So it's a two-step process, but again, photosynthesis is the main way that they're going to produce their energy, okay? So again, if I want my plants to grow and pass on their genes, I need them to be able to undergo photosynthesis a lot of times, right? And if we look at the level of carbon dioxide on Earth, we see that we had a very high level of CO2. And if I have a very high level of carbon dioxide, that means that I'm able to undergo photosynthesis at a very high rate, meaning that I can produce more energy, I can reproduce more successfully because I have even more energy, and as a result, that means that choice 1 has to be our correct answer, right? The increase in the number of plants on land had to be due to high levels of carbon dioxide that provided the carbon that was necessary to support an increase in the number of plants, right? If you have more carbon dioxide, guess what? More plants can undergo photosynthesis, more plants can reproduce, and the population of plants is going to skyrocket, right? Levels of oxygen have nothing to do with photosynthesis, right? Oxygen is a byproduct, right? With the sugar, we don't care. We don't need oxygen to undergo photosynthesis. So even if the concentration of oxygen is high or low, we're still going to get our energy regardless. And finally, choice 4, if we had low levels of CO2, that means that not a lot of plants would have enough carbon dioxide to undergo photosynthesis. So they would make less energy. And because they have less energy, well, they wouldn't be able to reproduce as much, or their populations wouldn't be able to grow. Right? So number 3 says, or asks us to identify numerical evidence from the graphs that supports an argument that oxygen levels affected animal evolution during the Devonian period as a part of a feedback between the atmosphere and the biosphere. So when we're talking about numerical evidence, we actually need numbers. And we need numbers from the graphs specifically. Well, what graphs was I given? Well, any one of these 3 graphs. So I need to cite some sort of change or some sort of numbers that are going to support the statement that, well, as the oxygen increased or the level of oxygen increased, the number of species of animals also increased. Well, let's look at that, right? So I'm not going to focus on this graph right here because this graph right here talks about plants. I only care about here animal evolution, right? Not plant evolution. So I'm going to cite evidence from either this graph or this graph. So an easy way to get points here is to look at the change in oxygen. So we know that oxygen is this dashed line right here. At the start of the Devonian, there was, somewhere around maybe 12% oxygen in the atmosphere. And at the end of the Devonian, we can see here how there was somewhere around, call that 21% oxygen in the environment. So this increase in oxygen from 12% to 21% allowed more animals to evolve, right? Because animals needed the oxygen to undergo cellular respiration, which is how they get their energy. Okay, so a good way to answer this question was we could have just said that animals need oxygen to undergo respiration. The increase in oxygen or O2 levels in the atmosphere from 12% to 21% allowed for more animals to live and reproduce and thus evolve, right? We need oxygen to live. If there's more oxygen, that means that the environment can support a larger number of species. Okay, so essentially what happened during the Devonian is that oxygen increased by almost 10%. So if there's 10% more oxygen available, well, there's more oxygen in the atmosphere for animals to breathe, and that environment can support more animals, okay? If you want it to be more specific, you can say that, the number of reptiles evolved, right? Because we see here how reptiles increased in the number of orders, and we see here how the number of insect genera also increased. We could have also said that during the Devonian, increased levels in oxygen in the atmosphere allowed insects to utilize that oxygen to increase the number of genera from 0 to 12. Okay, so again, even though I didn't cite the change in oxygen, what I did cite was the change in insect genera. And we can see here how we started off at 0 insect genera, and at the end of the Devonian, we had somewhere around 12 genera or 15 genera, right? So again, the takeaway here is that to get full points on this, you need to cite numbers from at least, or numbers or a change from at least one of these graphs, okay? So now we have the last two questions, which relate to this little blurb and these two charts. It says that the Devonian period ended with a major extinction event. Many of the organisms that were extinct were part of marine communities. The graph below shows or illustrates the mass extinctions that have occurred throughout Earth's history and the temperatures over a similar period. Okay, so here we see how there's been 5 major extinction events. Okay, and how do we know it's a major extinction event? Because, well, look at how many species are going extinct, right? We have 86% of the species going extinct, 57% of the genera going extinct, 27% of the families going extinct. Here we have 75% of the species going extinct, so on and so forth, right? And this is why it's important to memorize this organization, because as families go extinct, well, a family contains genuses, which are genera, and species, right? So if a lot of families go extinct, even more species go extinct as well. Okay, so again, we see here how there's 5 major events that happened here, and they're all followed by a majority of the species on the Earth being extinct or wiped out. Okay, and see here we have the change in climate or temperature over time. So let's see if we can find any trend between the temperature and the extinction events. So we see how this first extinction event occurred around 460 million years ago. So if we look at the temperature around 460 million years ago, right here, we can see here how it was relatively stable, right? From here to here, the climate is, or the temperature is described as hot. So even though there's dips in the temperature, it's still considered hot. And as a result, well, there's not really there's not much we can say about it, right? Sure, there was a small dip, about a couple degrees Celsius, but since we're still describing the climate as hot, it's not a significant change in temperature. Then we look at the Devonian extinction, which happened around 340 million years ago. So 340 million years ago is going to be somewhere around here. And again, we're still a part or inside of the zone that says that the climate of the Earth is hot. And again, the Devonian didn't really see that big of a change in temperature, right? Maybe 1 degree Celsius or so on and so forth. But again, we still describe the Earth as being hot. Okay, then we had this Permian extinction event, right? Which was, 260 million years ago. Okay. So 260 million years ago would be somewhere around here. And again, we see how the Permian extinction event is, again, during a point of relative temperature stability. What's interesting here is that the Earth went super cold, right? The temperature significantly dropped here between pretty much the end of the Permian, so 460 million years ago to 280 million years ago. Between 460 and 280, there wasn't any major extinction events. So the Earth pretty much had an ice age, right? It went and the temperature of the Earth decreased. We described the climate as now cold, and even though we had such a large dip in temperature, we still didn't have any major extinction events that came with that, okay? And this is important because number 4 asks us, or tells us, that a claim is made by a student that temperature changes alone directly caused the late Devonian extinction, and they want us to evaluate the evidence provided to determine the merit of this claim. So the merit of a claim is the validity of it. Is the claim valid or not, or is the claim truthful or not, okay? So this student is saying that, well, temperature changes alone resulted in the extinction. Well, first of all, that's not very true. That's not very valid, because we know that the temperature during the Devonian period was relatively stable, right? Barely increased, barely decreased. And we also know that this is false because there's been larger changes in temperature which haven't resulted in major extinction events, right? For example, this major dip in temperature didn't really result in an extinction event, and this major increase in temperature didn't really cause one either, right? Sure, around here, around this peak, there was an extinction event, but there was no extinction event in the 100 million years of the Earth warming up from this dip right here. So again, we can say here that since other major time periods of temperature change do not always coincide with a major extinction, it's not possible to tell if these factors alone, or the temperature alone, caused the Devonian extinction, right? Which is pretty much saying that because other changes in temperatures don't line up with extinction events, we can't say that this is only caused or only due to a temperature or a change in temperature. We could also say that the claim should be refuted because the temperature change during the Devonian was minimal, and yet a mass extinction occurred then. So other factors must have been at play. So as long as you mention the fact that, oh, well, other extinction events didn't need a change in temperature to occur, or as long as you mentioned the fact that, well, there wasn't a change in temperature during the Devonian period, and as a result, this claim is false, you would have gotten full credit here. So again, last question. This cluster says that compared to the late Devonian period, extinction rates have dramatically decreased. However, human activity and the rising carbon levels in our atmosphere are global challenges considered to be factors affecting extinction. One proposed solution is using geological carbon sequestration to capture carbon directly from fossil fuel burning power plants and store it in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, saline formations, or deep coal beds approximately 800 meters below the Earth's surface. So what's happening here is that, sure, the amount of extinction has decreased heavily, right? We are in this time period right here, 0 million years ago, right? It's much lower than the extinction rate beforehand. But as you know, right, animals and species are still going extinct because we're leading or causing global warming, right? We're burning fossil fuels that are releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and as a result, that's increasing the temperature of our Earth and causing some climates and some environments to be destroyed. Okay, so as a solution, instead of allowing this carbon dioxide to enter our atmosphere, what people want to do is they want to sequester it or gather it, right? Sequester means to gather. And we're going to gather this carbon dioxide that's being released and we're going to store it deep underground, right? We're going to store it in coal beds that are 800 meters below the ground, or we're going to store it in old gas wells, right? Old pockets of gas that we have, since harvested, which are again underneath the ground. So we're going to take all this gas and we're going to store it inside of our crust. That way it doesn't go and enter the atmosphere to increase the temperature. So now number 5 asks us to describe a constraint that would need to be considered to minimize the effect on ecosystems and biodiversity when designing a system to geologically sequester carbon. So when you're trying to sequester or trying to contain and take away the carbon into a new environment, what's one factor that you should care about? Well, first of all, you want to make sure that the carbon dioxide isn't going to harm the environment, right? When you're collecting this carbon, when you're sequestering it, when you're taking it away, you should make sure that you're taking it away into a place where it can't further harm the environment. So you could say that designers would need to make sure to pump carbon into a layer that would not allow it to leak into the surrounding areas where it could possibly hurt organisms in that area, right? So when you pump it into the ground, you want to make sure that there's no escape for this carbon dioxide, because if this carbon dioxide were to escape into the surrounding soils, it would make it more acidic, and as a result, the life around it would suffer or die. So the first constraint is proper containment, right? You want to properly contain whatever you put into the ground. The second thing you could have said here was that it would be important to limit the amount of space that is used by geological carbon sequestration equipment, right? You want to make sure that whatever process you're putting carbon dioxide into these old pockets with or by isn't taking up too much space. You want to make sure that you don't need to dedicate an entire mile of area or of land to build a facility or a factory that will then pump carbon dioxide into the ground. You want to make sure that it takes up minimal space. Why? Because the more space you take up, the more space you're stealing from animals in that environment, right? And if you take up a crazy amount of space just to pump carbon into the ground, what's going to happen is that you're going to take away or destroy or occupy the habitats of animals, and as a result, that's going to decrease the biodiversity because it's going to harm the ecosystem. You're taking away habitats, okay? So those were 2 perfectly good answers that would have gotten you full credit here, okay? So as long as you said limiting the amount of space that the equipment takes, or as long as you said that making sure that the carbon dioxide cannot leak into the environment, you would have gotten full credit. And that's the end of this section. So if you have any questions as to anything that I went over today, please let me know in the comments down below. Again, if you're still confused about the format of this exam, please check out the video in the description, the top video in the description. It goes over everything you need to know about the new format of this test. Hope you guys learned something, and I hope you have a nice night.